very first tour, if any of you have started to go through the exhibition yet, you have probably seen that it's enormous. There are 287 objects, so like bear with me, we're going to get through it in 45 minutes, I believe we can do this. So again, Brittany Salisbury, curator of prints and drawings at the CMA and curator of the CMA's presentation of Picasso and Paper. As many of you probably know the backstory of the show a little bit. It was co-organized with the Royal Academy of Arts in London with the support of the Musée National Picasso in Paris. And it opened at the Royal Academy in April 2020 and was on view for about 6 weeks before we all know what happened in April 2020. Everything shut down for COVID. So the exhibition was taken down in London and postponed indefinitely here in Cleveland. So it's a show that's been in process here at the CMA for about a decade at this point. So we're really excited to finally get it on view and be able to share it with everyone. The majority of the works in the exhibition are from the collection of the Picasso Museum in Paris. And this is the largest repository of Picasso's artwork in the world and contains artworks that he kept in his studio for his entire life and were still there after his death. So we're excited to be able to feature those, as well as numerous other international and national museums as well. So we'll start this first gallery is devoted to, the exhibition proceeds chronologically. So one of the things I like about it is that, if you're someone who, you're welcome to come closer if you like, so you're on your bed. I think it's great because you can come into the exhibition either having only heard of who Picasso is, like literally as you bought your ticket, or you can come in as someone who knows Picasso really well, and you can still come out of the show having learned a lot. It proceeds chronologically, so we'll get a nice overview of Picasso's life and work, but it looks at his work and his career through a new and different angle, which is his fascination with paper. And so the show includes, we'll see examples of things like printmaking and drawing that are more traditional techniques that we might know and understand ourselves. But we can also see the way that paper was at the core of how he developed ideas and how he became really experimental, how he rethought his compositions, how he rethought the way that he worked with the materials and processes that were available to him. And so it gives the nice overview of his career, but introduces a slightly different angle. And so the gallery that we're in right now is devoted to Picasso's very early work and his blue period. And so the first few drawings in the gallery on the wall here are studies that he created as basically as a child. His father was a professor of drawing and a museum curator, and so he had the benefit of really early on in his life someone who recognized his artistic talent and did whatever he could to support him. He had like a really encouraging background, and so I love these two particular drawings because you might not ever immediately guess that they're by Picasso. They're so straightforward in terms of artistic education. But I think I like the way that they show that Picasso is someone who we might think of as being very avant-garde, but is really starting with tradition, and that sort of tradition stays at the very core of a lot of what he does throughout his career. Moving on to one of the CMA's great modern paintings, Picasso's La Vie. You probably recognize this work from our galleries upstairs, and it's anyone who knows Picasso, this is the reason they know Cleveland, because this is one of his best known paintings. And I especially like the way we've been able to reinstall this in this exhibition. Is we've been able to show the painting, which we have probably seen before, alongside two drawings, two earlier studies from the Picasso Museum in Paris and the Picasso Museum in Barcelona that show how he really reconsidered the composition and struggled with the way that it would look before he ever started to put paint on canvas. The painting is from Picasso's blue period. Picasso is an artist who is, as you may know, whose career is really structured by a sequence of very distinct periods. His blue period was his earliest, identifiable period when he was living between Spain and Paris, and first starting to struggle with his identity as an artist. He was, part of a group of avant-garde artists who are rethinking the idea of what art should be and working to incorporate aspects of modern life into their work. So think like, the sort of generation after the Impressionists in Paris. And he really started to develop the style of his blue period following the death of one of his closest friends, Carl Casagemas, by suicide. His friend had pursued a woman who was not interested in him and ultimately killed himself after their relationship fell apart. And so through the two drawings, we can see that Picasso originally set out to make a painting of his friend Casagemas and his girlfriend. And he has like a very sort of straightforward pose inspired by historical painting and where Casagemas is sort of pointing upward. He eventually rethought that composition and added a third figure on the other side of the painting and situated the painting in the artist's studio. We can see that how this sort of progression leads to the final painting as we know and understand it today, in which Casagemas appears with his girlfriend alongside this a mother and child, and still sort of in this space that seems to be like a studio. But I think what this shows us is something that comes up again and again throughout the exhibition, which is that Picasso, it took a lot, he really thought through any work that he did. He considered any possible variation on the composition before ever settling on a final work, and continued to rethink things over and over again. And in this painting, or this gallery, I'll also point out just on this wall over here, this particular print is the first one that Picasso made. It was the sort of beginning of a lifelong relationship that he had with printmaking. And he made this print during his blue period, and just as a reflection of his economic struggles at the time, he actually used a zinc plate. Usually an artist will use a copper plate to make an etching. Zinc was more affordable and so easier for him to get his hands on. And he actually used a plate that he had gotten from one of his friends. And so you can see, if you think about the image oriented horizontally, the very faint traces of the landscape that his friend had drawn in the background. So not a bad legacy for an artist who's his friend, whose name we don't know or really recognize today, just sort of have this afterlife for his work and the background of a Picasso print. So the evolution of Picasso's work, which changed, as I mentioned, changed very quickly and often sometimes very dramatically. This evolution in his work was often tied to changes in his life. And so around 1904, he started to move away from the work of his blue period and into what we call his rose period. And the reasons for this were he met a woman. Fernand Olivier lived in the building where his studio was in Paris, and they quickly developed a close relationship. And she was well known at the time as a model for several important avant-garde artists, but she was actually an artist in her own right. And Picasso's depictions of her kind of overshadowed this aspect of her life. And so in this gallery, we have many examples of Picasso's rose period works, which are a particular strength of the CMA's collection. So the painting on the wall behind you and several of the drawings in this gallery are from the CMA's holdings. And Picasso and Olivier took a trip together in 1906 to a town called Gozal on the Spanish-French border. And Picasso was really just drawn in by the sort of ochre, pinkish tones of the landscape there. And so this led him to start directly incorporating those colors in his own work, as well as the general, the change in his personal life and this sort of improvement of his circumstances with his relationship. And so I think I'll point out this particular drawing, which is in a case because of its extreme fragility. Picasso was using different kinds of paints and layering paints in layering these types of paints in a really unusual and experimental way. And while he was doing this, not at all thinking about the sort of afterlife that these works would have. And so the paint is often really, really fragile. This work from our collection, our paper conservator deemed was fragile enough that it actually could not hang on the wall. It would be much safer to present it in this case. This is one particular portrait that Picasso made in Gozal of Olivier that he ended up directly incorporating into the painting that you see behind you, the harem from around this time, which is considered his great Rose period work. But we've also been able to, just because of being able to draw on the collections of the Picasso Museum, we've been able to include the painting, this very finished study, but then also over here a sketchbook where we can see Picasso just starting to develop the composition of that he will eventually use. And then I'll just point out in this case, Picasso and Olivier ended up breaking up several years later. Later in life, she wrote sort of an expose of her time and relationship with Picasso. And it has these really wonderful drawings that she made of herself, of Picasso, of people in her social circle. And so, in the context of this gallery with many depictions that Picasso made of her, we've also included this self-portrait that she made of herself. So starting off in this case, the works in this gallery are all related to one of Picasso's best-known paintings, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which he completed in 1907. But we know that up to a full year before he actually completed the painting, he was starting to think about the composition through studies, through sketches, through analysis of other artworks and things like that. And so this gallery really closely traces the evolution of his painting and his work. And Picasso, as an artist who explored every aspect of his compositions, created a total of 16 full sketchbooks of studies for the painting before beginning to make the painting. And so we have 3 examples of those here, and we can see the sort of different formats and different figures that he studies. So the painting is one of the most controversial paintings in the history of modern art because of both because of its subject. It depicts 5 sex workers who directly look at us, the viewer, but also because of the style. Picasso is first starting to work with some of the geometric formal distortions of Cubism that he will continue to develop in the following years. And one thing that he's directly looking at, directly appropriating is Iberian and African art, which he's seeing at museums throughout Paris and starting to collect some examples of himself. And so in some cases, he's just directly copying things that he's seen. And there's a few examples on the wall behind you, for example, of a African sculpture that he's just sort of directly copied. The watercolor on the wall here is the final study that he made for the painting before he started to actually to put paint on canvas. And we can see that through the sketchbooks, we can see he originally planned to include the 5 women and 2 men in the painting with them. And in the final version, how he's removed the 2 men so the women are directly staring at us. And it was, a painting that when he finished, his first, his next step was showing it to some of his friends. People, like even his closest colleagues and friends, found it completely unintelligible. One of his friends compared looking at it to being like drinking gasoline. And so he kept it in his studio, continued thinking about, what he would do with it, what it meant, and didn't end up showing it until about a decade later. While he's doing all this, he is starting to think through some of the developments of Cubism and sort of developing that as a style. So we can go to see that in the next gallery. So beginning around 1907, Picasso begins to work very closely with another artist named Georges Braque to develop what we know today as Cubism. And that development is explored chronologically in this gallery. And the great thing about working with the Picasso Museum's collection is, if you wanted to teach a class, an art history class about Cubism, you could do it entirely with just these works. It's like, the best examples of exactly how this development occurred. So he started to think about Cubism after a trip to the Spanish city, a Spanish town called Horta de Ebro, which you can see in a photograph in the corner, where he was really struck by the way that by the architecture of the city and the way that the rooftops sort of overlapped. And he started to think about the ways in which that might develop into geometric shapes that sort of overlapped and hinged and connected on to one another to explore a subject. So the first, working with Braque, Picasso embarks on the first stage of Cubism, which is called analytic Cubism. And it's defined by taking a recognizable subject and sort of breaking it down into these component geometric parts and giving the viewer just enough visual clues that we can identify what it actually is, but also we are forced to think about the way that we see it and think about the act of vision and the idea of perception itself. And so we've been able to include a series of works that are all related to guitars, violins along this wall, so it's nice you can see like a single subject and how it progresses in his work. So this is the guitarist from 1911, and then Picasso moves into the second stage of Cubism, which is called synthetic Cubism, in which he starts working more with collage and adding found materials to build his subjects rather than break them apart into geometric forms. And so he especially likes using things like newspaper, wallpaper, just as a way of integrating the ephemeral of aspects of everyday life into the work itself. And here you can see he's included an article from the popular French newspaper Le Journal. He liked it because it was the newspaper everyone read, and so it had this sort of popularity that he liked. And he would often, when he would create these shapes, he would choose specific articles. So it rewards looking closely and actually like reading what he's chosen. And there's sometimes like puns or jokes or things like that. And he also liked the way that these very ephemeral materials were low quality. And so it was the lowest quality of paper was used to produce them. So they would discolor over time and turn this brownish tone. And this was something he knew would happen and really kind of embraced in his work. I especially like this example, which people are often drawn to because it literally glows. But it is what you're seeing here is a violin, the cutout shape of a violin, sandwiched between two pieces of paper. And it's in front of a light box. If the light box wasn't turned on, it would just look like a piece of paper. But he's someone who loves different types of paper, and he loves the watermarks that are often found in examples of paper that he uses in the studio. And this like sort of text that's on the maker's name that's only visible when you look at it next to light. And so he's playing on that idea by creating an artwork that you can only see when it's exposed to background light. Any questions so far? Great. We're making good time. We'll go over to the last gallery on this slide. And it's impossible to walk past this without talking about it. This is a ballet costume that Picasso made for a performance of a ballet called Parade. And you can see the actual ballet performance on the screen. And in the gallery, we also have some designs that he made for the stage curtain, the makeup for the performers, some of their costumes, things like that. And so Picasso worked with a ballet company at the time called the Ballet Russe, which was an important company in like the staging of avant-garde plays, ballets, performances in the early 20th century. And so he was invited to create, do all of the design for a particular performance of this work, which had music composed by Eric Satie and a stage play by Jean Cocteau. So it was a lot of like important avant-garde figures at his time coming together for this one performance. And the concept of the play was that there were a series of managers who were trying to recruit audience members to come in and watch different performers perform for like the price of a ticket. And so this was the American manager who was trying to attract clientele to come see a dancer doing a performance. And all the managers are ultimately unsuccessful. And it's kind of like this metaphor for the struggle of an artist to attract an audience. But Picasso made these, this is a loan from the Paris Opera, so it's a costume that's actually used in performances now. It's a reconstruction from the 1970s of the original. But when the person who brought this from the opera came to install it, she said that the dancers absolutely hate wearing this. Understandably. It's like all made of like really hard cardboard, and so it's basically impossible to move in. But that's like kind of the part of the performance, you know.
Can they see?
Oh, there's a little bit.
Is there? Okay, I couldn't see the pen.
Yeah. So.
Do you know if there were any famous dancers that were in any of these pieces?
I am not sure. That's an excellent question, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, no, it's I think they said that the most recently this particular costume had been used was the 1990s. Any questions about this side of the exhibition before we move over to the other side? So while Picasso is working on Parade and like the designs for Parade, World War I is taking place, and so he moves with the entire dance company and everyone involved with it to Italy to live and work there during the war. And while he's in Rome, he starts to he starts to think about the legacy of Cubism and whether Cubism has run its course and what other direction his work can take. And so I especially love these portrait drawings because it's like maybe the last thing you might think of when you think about Picasso and you're more familiar with his Cubist work. But he became very interested in the late teens, early 20s in the idea of the French classical tradition and the idea of classicism in general because he's living in Italy. And so he makes this series of portrait drawings of his friends, of colleagues, of other people in his social circle, and often poses them very similarly, sometimes even in the same chair in his studio, and often works from photographs. So aiming for this incredible degree of precision. And I think the technique for these is really fascinating too because he starts out drawing the portraits in graphite and then actually erases the graphite and reinforces the sort of ghosts of the lines in charcoal. So you get like the sort of stark black line of the charcoal, but with this real definite linearity. It's like it's a really striking composition. And when he's making these, he's thinking about the 19th century French artist Jean-Auguste Ingres, who was also known for making very similar graphite pencil drawings of his friends in social circles. So this is the beginning of Picasso sort of starting to think really deliberately about his place within the canon of art history and like who he's connected to, who he's influenced by, what his place will be in the grand narrative of art history, which is something that comes up again and again in the galleries that follow. So I always like, I like to point out these portraits. I like them. a lot. Around the same time, we have some examples of, he's living and working in Italy, and so he starts to look at ancient sculpture, and these are just a few examples of works where he's working in his drawings, evoking the same sort of monumentality that he sees in ancient sculpture, and but also just using, not always defaulting to the best known, best understood techniques. So here, he's working on a treated canvas that then drawing with graphite and charcoal. So it's something between, it ends up being something, it has, the monumentality of a painting, but also sort of the intimacy and the sort of lack of finish of a drawing. So it's like he has a difficulty throughout his entire life of ever, saying that a work is completely finished. He once said, that declaring a work finishes is its death. So you see him a lot, doing this sort of in-between sort of technique throughout his lifetime. So this is a gallery that I think also might be a little bit surprising to anyone who really knows Picasso strictly as a cubist. He actually had a really long-term engagement with another major movement in the early 20th century called Surrealism, which was focused on depicting dreams and the unconscious through artistic processes. And Picasso didn't really set out to be a surrealist. He was identified early on by the artist who came to be known as a surrealist as a really major influence, as sort of like a forefather of their movement. And they really tried to recruit him into their group and exhibited his works in their shows until finally he kind of came to see himself as a surrealist. And one of the ways that we can see him most obviously connecting with surrealism is this interest that he had especially during the later 1920s, the early 1930s, in these what we call biomorphic forms. So forms that are vaguely human-like, but also a little bit strange. Depicting the human form, but also sort of drawing from the subconscious. And so this is a series of drawings, prints, and then the final sculpture that he created, all of which depict his much younger romantic partner, Marie-Therese Walter, who he met when he was in his 50s and she was 17 and a half. So he carried out a long-term relationship with her, and she was a constant subject for his work. And so we see him in these works, breaking down the shapes that he sees as comprising the face in a way that kind of evokes what he had been doing with Cubism, but which also plays on this sort of surrealist interest in these particular types of forms. And one thing I think is particularly interesting about these prints, going back to his interest in paper and the techniques that involve paper, is around this time he also became very actively interested in printing his own work. And so many artists around this time were interested in the process of designing prints and making the drawings that would end up as prints, but less interested in actually doing the work of printing them. Picasso loved every aspect of the process, wanted to be very directly involved, much more than most other artists of his time. And so during the early 1930s, he actually acquired his former printer's printing press, put it in his studio, and started to print his own, design and print his own work. And so these are a few examples where we see him using an incredibly complicated and experimental combination of techniques that required a lot of technical know-how, and then going on to actually print his works. And so sometimes in doing that, leaving more ink on the plate very deliberately, sometimes wiping it very cleanly, but just showing a really sophisticated knowledge of both every aspect of printmaking, which I think is really fascinating. Okay, we'll head into the next gallery.
That's a tough 17-and-a-half-year-old head. There.
So there's a lot to take in this gallery. There's a lot of works that are really central to Picasso's career. And an event that was really transformative for him was the Spanish Civil War, which he felt that he often described himself as an apolitical artist, as someone whose art was never about politics, but he was really drawn into the conflict of the Spanish Civil War, of the fight in Spain between democracy and fascism, and really kind of made it a frequent subject of his work in the mid to late 1930s. And the painting, perhaps, that Picasso is best known for today is his painting Guernica, which unfortunately cannot travel, but which he was commissioned to create for the Spanish Pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris. And it was meant to be a statement about the horrors of war. It depicts the bombing of Guernica, which was a village in Spain. It was bombed by the National Socialists, and it was there was no like wartime purpose for its bombing. It was entirely meant to create civilian casualties. And so Picasso wanted to draw attention to this this atrocity through his work. And so he started to think about what his great anti-war paintings would be like. And so along this back wall we have drawings that he made while he was considering the composition of Guernica. And so through them we see, of course, again, he's considering like every single figure in the painting, what the painting would look like, but also that he thought about making it very colorful. The drawing of the horse is one example that has very bright, vivid colors. And so he thought that that might be what the painting looks like. Today, it's one of the things that makes it so distinctive is the very monochromatic black and white palette that he ended up settling on. But one thing we can see through the two photographs in the corner, which were taken by his partner at the time, Dora Maar, was that he originally considered incorporating aspects of collage, and he reworked the painting several times before settling on the way that it looked. And supposedly he actually decided to make it entirely in grays, blacks, and whites after seeing these photographs that Dora Maar had taken of the painting while it was in progress. He thought that the tonality of the black and white photographs was really striking. He met Dora Maar shortly before he started making the painting. She was a major figure in his life throughout the time the works in this gallery were made. And she was an incredibly accomplished surrealist artist and photographer who had a major influence on his work. We also see her in the largest work in the exhibition, his 1937 collage, Women in Their Toilette, which he created as a collage but was actually intended to serve as the design for a tapestry. He made several different tapestries in collaboration with the French government in the 30s, but this one was not ultimately realized until much later, in the early 1970s, because he wanted to keep the collage in the studio during his lifetime. And what it depicts is, like much of his work, it depicts the women in his life. And so we see Olga Koklova, who was actually his first wife. She was one of two women that he actually married during his lifetime. She was a performer who had been part of the Ballet Russe that staged Parade. So we see her, we see Mary Therese Walter, who we saw in the sculpture, and then Dora Maar, who took the photographs. And supposedly the portrait, the little square that she holds, may be a portrait of Picasso. But you can see that he still has this real interest in using wallpaper and different collage materials in his work as a way of incorporating the everyday. This is actually the first time this has traveled from the Picasso Museum in Paris to the United States for reasons that are probably self-evident. I don't think our registrar would ever want to attempt this again. It took an incredible amount of coordination and logistics to get this work into the building. So it's a really exceptional work. So this gallery looks at two bodies of work that Picasso made mostly throughout the 1950s, in which he again was thinking more deliberately, as he became older, about the place that he would have within the history of art. And so he did this by starting to look at great paintings of the past that had really inspired him. And so the works in this gallery look at two paintings in particular. Eugène Delacroix, who was a French 19th century romantic artist, his painting Women of Algiers. And you can see one of the paintings that Picasso made after Delacroix's painting, and some studies for it. And then the Impressionist artist Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which Picasso explored in many paintings and drawings and sketchbooks throughout his career. You can see one of Picasso's versions of Luncheon on the Grass, as well as prints that he made after it, and then also one of the linoleum blocks that he used to make prints. So it kind of allows you to consider his technique in a different way. And I especially love these little cutouts that he made while he was working on the different versions that he created of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, of the actual figures in the painting. And so as he was making the painting that you see behind the figures, he could take the figures and reposition them, reshape them, and use them to think about the way that the painting would actually look. He ended up working with another artist, a Swedish artist, to ultimately realize these little cutouts as monumental concrete sculptures that are in a museum in Sweden today. So, even the materials that he used to think about the painting kind of have this afterlife. But thinking about the influence of great paintings and incorporating them into his own work, and looking really closely at that during this period. Make a quick stop over here because I think these are really kind of fun and quirky. This gallery looks at materials and techniques in Picasso's work, and just instances in which he thought in really unusual ways through existing the sort of tools that were available to him. The works in this case show, I think, just the entirety of his interest in paper. Like, he loved any kind of paper. It didn't matter if it was paper that was intended for making works of art. He was just fascinated with the tactility of it, and he never threw anything away. So this photograph here is actually like a bundle of papers. When he ran out of room on the floor of his studio and just in his studio space, he started hanging bundles of paper from the ceiling so he wouldn't have to throw anything away. So total hoarder situation. These are just a few of the things that he kept throughout his life. This, I think, is fascinating. It's a paper mache sculpture of a wad of paper, crumpled up. So he crumpled up the paper and then made paper mache of the paper. So it's just I think it's just wonderful. Then just some examples of paper sample books that he kept. So anytime he was working on artwork, he could go through and choose exactly what he wanted. And then just junk mail that he got. He would draw, he was constantly drawing. He would just make sketches on any piece of mail that he received or that he sent out before he put it in the mail. This particular print I think is really fun. a print that he made early in his life, but it was he had a wooden bowl in his home, and so he carved an image in the bottom of the wooden bowl and tried to print it. So this is a print made from the bottom of the bowl. So just like incredibly experimental, just have this kind of like fun spirit of working with paper. So I think these works are especially. So these two pairs of work are, were both created during the time when, or around the time that Picasso was in a relationship with a woman named Françoise Gillot. And she's incredibly well known as a model in Picasso's work. He depicted her many, many times. But she was also like an incredibly accomplished painter and draftswoman in her own right. And so these are two examples where Picasso and Gillot are looking at the same subject and looking at the same subject, creating amazing works of art that are just slightly different. So these are this is a portrait of Gillot and then a self-portrait of Gillot, created around the same time. Hers is actually a little bit earlier. But you can see the way that they're working alongside each other and have this sort of symbiotic relationship in the way that they're thinking through their art. And I like it because it complicates the idea that she was just sort of, a muse for him. And it suggests that instead, they were influencing each other and they were really determining the course that one another's art would take over the time that they were together. Same for both of these works. These are both still lifes. This is a still life drawing by Gillot, and this is a lino cut of a still life by Picasso. This particular drawing I especially love because it is a very recent acquisition by the Cleveland Museum of Art. So this is part of a collection now. It's the first time it's ever been on view. But you can see the way that, they're both looking at the same kinds of things. They're both abstracting things in the same way. And, he rightly gets a lot of credit in the history of art, but I think that she suggests that she deserves an important place as well. So just trying to complicate these works. Any questions? So this particular wall includes clips from a film that Picasso created with the filmmaker Clouseau in the mid-50s, in which Clouseau was trying to create a film. He's like a well-known filmmaker, and he was hoping to create a film that would explore the creative process and the translation from the idea in the artist's head to the artist's hand, trying to capture that visually. And so what they settled on was a system where they put papers in frames, like approximately like this. It was just cheap newsprint. And Picasso would draw on the piece of newsprint using felt tip markers, which had just been invented. They were like brand new and exciting American inventions that were imported for this purpose. But as you can see in the film, if this were the actual studio, Picasso's on the other side of the paper. We're on the side where the marker is bleeding through the paper, so it allows the image to appear as Picasso draws it and to represent the creative process in a different way. And so each clip is next to the work that it shows the creation of, and the drawings from the film are another thing that we're glad to be able to do because they were completely restored specifically for this exhibition and brought back to their originals. So this is the first time that they've been like this. All right, then we'll go into Picasso's final studio. So toward the end of Picasso's life, he established a studio in the south of France, moved between a few cities, but spent all of his time in the southern part of the country because he saw it as tying to his experiences living in France, but also more directly connected to Spain, given the proximity of the country. And so he found the south of France as like a really comfortable place for him to to establish his final studio and spend the rest of his life there. He lived there with another female partner named Jacqueline Roque, who was a salesperson at the studio that made ceramic pieces that he started. He began designing ceramics and she sold ceramics there. They began a relationship, and she was incredibly supportive at managing his final studio and the logistics of making prints and bringing materials back and forth, and just did a lot to sort of start to establish his legacy toward the end of his life. And at the end of his life, he entered an incredibly prolific period. He knew that he had a major surgery within the last decade of his life, and so he started to think about his own mortality and what he would leave. And so the two prints here are from these incredibly large series of etchings that he created with two printers, Aldo and Piero Cromling, who were based in Mougins, the village where he was living at the time. And he worked very directly with them. Sometimes would create up to 16 prints in a single day, so designing the plates and printing them. This particular print, I feel like, does a really nice job of sort of summing up the exhibition and summing up the final years of Picasso's life. And so this is made in 1978, so within the last half decade before he dies. But as he is from a series of 347 prints that he made and designed as a group. And within this series, which is known as Suite 347, he is really revisiting the subjects that we've seen him, focus on throughout his entire career. He does a lot of self-portraits, and so the title of this particular work is Picasso, His Work, and His Public. So he shows himself as an artist with this crowd of people behind him, like a sort of a circus subject, which we saw him focusing on a lot during his blue and rose periods. And so it just kind of distills a lot of the things that he's been thinking about throughout his entire life, the entire exhibition, but also doing so with this this very creative experimental printmaking technique that he's been developing since the very first print that we saw in the first gallery over the course of his entire life. So we made it through in under an hour. Over 45 minutes that left.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank you